Leticia, who was dragged by the Zion while trying to sneak away, muttered. She was uncomfortable in this situation, lying on the forearm of the Prince of the Holy Empire. His hand naturally came between Leticia's front cleavage to check her wounds. Leticia's feeling was still complicated even if it was not for the first time. She turned her head to the side. He is overly self-conscious. Upon seeing his red lips that seemed to be mocking for her embarrassment, Leticia knew well it was a miracle she could survive from death. If she hadn't met Zion, she would have died. However, he continued to scratch the wound, as if he wanted Leticia to bleed to death. Leticia's eyes moved towards him. She couldn't help but ask why he saved her, because it seemed things like humanity didn't exist for Zion. He could just leave her to die. She has a right to ask about that. But Zion, gracefully ignoring her question, and questioning about her family, Violette and Winchester that kicked her, and the reason she ended up getting stabbed and drowned in the river. Leticia, who was frightened by his gaze, trembled in fear without realizing it. Zion frowned when Leticia gasped as if she was having a seizure. She lowered her head because of the sharp pain and saw the bright red bandage. Zion, who barely managed to stop the bleeding, said in his low sensual voice that it was okay for her to stay longer with him. Before Leticia could deny it, his hand grasped her chest and pressed it gently, caressing her wound. A cruel smile suddenly appeared on his face. Zion muttered as he touched her erected peak with his fingertip. Leticia glared at him, trembling in shame. The moment she made eye contact with Zion, she couldn't let a word escape her lips. Zion's eyes focused on Leticia's bleeding wound. It's annoying when he thinks the wound keeps bleeding, but he had to stop the bleeding so it doesn't get infected. Leticia no longer had the strength to defend herself and closed her eyes in silence. At the time, someone strode in through the half-open door and screamed in shock. The young man who saw Leticia's miserable expression protested in pity. He was very surprised when he saw one of Zion's hands was still pressing Leticia's breasts like dough. Leticia couldn't bear it anymore. Suddenly, the entire room shook violently. Leticia was confused. She thought it was an earthquake. When she realized, she already in Zion's arms. The sarcastic, handsome face in front of her, mocking Leticia, who was ignored by her husband. Contrary to his harsh words, Zion kissed Leticia's forehead sympathetically. His attitude was cruel, as if he was playing with a toy. Her stiff arm twitched away from Zion's neck. Zion got up from the bed and called his aide. Langaro scratched his cheek and placed a sheet over her body. He glanced outside the door and caught a glimpse of his master, who had just left, adding that Zion is not a bad person. Leticia, who finally regained her composure, managed to reply. Zion's aide, Langaro Mahashan, had an exotic appearance. His tall body, dark skin like chocolate, and long silver hair that contrast to his dark skin were beautiful and mysterious. And the monocle he wore on only an eye. Langaro formally greeted her, placing one hand on his chest. When he asked her name, Leticia had no choice but to respond. And it was uncomfortable to use the last name of her husband's family who abandoned her. Will Astor know that his beloved mistress tried to kill Leticia, or is he also an accomplice? Thinking about it make her crazy. Leticia tried to clear her head and asked, looking at the slightly shaking floor. Langaro smiled, explaining that they were on a passenger ship in Westeros, and stretched out his hand to open the window curtain. Only then did the moonlight pour in, and the blue waves embroidering the outside were visible. The interior was so luxurious that she didn't even realize she was inside the cabin. Westeros was the Holy Empire that had to be far west from Northland, and they were heading to the West Continent. Langaro said that he and Zion visited Northland for work. When they arrived at the port, they found Leticia washed up on the riverside with a miserable appearance, and her skin turned bluish. Langaro thought she was dead. Leticia lowered her head, looking at her treated wound, and thanked Langaro for saving her life. Langaro, who received a polite thanks, shook his hand in embarrassment. He asked if she need to, he would send a flue to the house of Violette and Winchester. Now that they have saved her life, they're going to inform her family. Leticia was speechless. How should she explain to this foreigner that she was abandoned her husband, even by her family? Seeing Leticia hesitate to open her mouth, Langaro blurted out he had figured out the situation. Leticia could not believe her ears as she heard it, but looked at Langaro smile. And he explained that Zion already sent a messenger to the house of Violette and Winchester because she had been on the brink for almost a week. But when the messenger arrived at the house of Violette, it was in vain because the Countess was not in her place. Leticia tilted her head in confusion. Did she go shopping again? Because Xenia was very fond of grooming herself with all her luxurious dresses, shoes, and jewelry. Especially after Leticia gave up her father's legacy, all of the money was given to Xenia. She was the one who caused the bankruptcy to the Violette's house. Langaro looked at Leticia pitifully. She had just woken up from her bedridden. The butler of the Violette house explains Xenia is attending her adoptive daughter's funeral, who has been suffering from depression for a long time. Her condition worsened as she attended her father's funeral. She came to her parents' house that day and cried because she missed the deceased and ended her life by jumping into the river in front of her stepmother. She cried throughout the funeral and fainted in her son-in-law's arms as she was the last person to witness Leticia jump to the river. Leticia was shocked. She couldn't believe what she heard. A story about her, even she herself didn't know, flowed from someone else's mouth. Leticia had never suffered from depression, and she committed suicide following her father by jumping into the river. It's all lie. What's actually happened, her husband was taken away from her, and she was stabbed by her husband's mistress and pushed into the river. It was clear that Xenia had completely joined in with those kites. If the truth is told, Aster and Leonka will be suspected. Aster was very infatuated with his mistress. He was generous to her and did not even try to hide their love. In Northland society, it wasn't a big deal for a man to have one or two mistresses. But killing his wife because of his mistress was a completely different story. If Leonka is known as the final witness, people would have whispering that she pushed Leticia to take her place as Aster's wife. Then, Aster will be charged with conspiracy and pointed as the mastermind of his wife's murder and investigated. Leticia's mind was all mixed up. Why did Xenia joining hands with them? What she gets in return? Was she the real culprit who killed her father? And how did Leonka know about that?